Sometimes boating will just smack you down pretty hard. Just like some of the people will find out as we go through this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. Our first story to make the boating news this week is actually going to take us over to Bali, where this was the scene a little over a week ago when the Cebu Iwu Express was about 25 minutes into its trip from Nusa Penida heading to Sanur when all of a sudden it sprang a leak and began to sink approximately 2 miles offshore from its final destination. On board the vessel were 28 tourists visiting Bali along with 6 crew members of the vessel. Fortunately, due to Good Samaritan vessels being close by in the area, everybody was actually able to be rescued without injury. But as we mentioned, with 28 people on board the vessel being tourists, they were actually being transported to local resorts, which means they had their luggage, passports, travel visas, and other items like that on board with them, and many of them lost these items during the trip, leaving many people scrambling trying to figure out what their next move was. Local Bali officials have launched an investigation into the incident to try and determine exactly what caused this vessel to sink. But locals are saying they don't understand why the ferry was even out there. There was a small craft advisory issued for the area during this time, and at the time, most ferry services had been canceled, leaving many locals questioning whether the ferry should have even been on the water at this time at all. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us over to San Juan, Puerto Rico, where this was the scene approximately 6 miles off the coast of San Juan, when 2 fishermen went out for a day of fishing when their 25-foot vessel took a wave over the bow, causing the boat to capsize. Fortunately, this crew was well prepared as they had a personal locator beacon on board the vessel, which quickly sent emergency crews their exact location. The Coast Guard launched air and marine assets to the location where they discovered the capsized vessel and the 2 fishermen. The crews quickly went to work to get the men out of the water and bring them to safety. Both the fishermen wind up coming out of this without any injuries whatsoever. The Coast Guard uses this as a good reminder. If you're gonna go offshore, make sure you go offshore prepared, have proper flotation devices for everybody on the vessel, and use some sort of EPIRB or personal locator beacon in case of an emergency. Here, if these guys would not have had that device on the vessel, we'd probably be telling a very different story today. Instead of seeing these images of the gentlemen leaving the Coast Guard boat at San Juan Station being reunited with their families. Our next story to make the boating news is going to keep us in Puerto Rico, where this was the scene just a few days ago when the U.S. Coast Guard says it had to rescue 19 Haitians who were left abandoned by smugglers on an uninhabited island near Puerto Rico. The initial report came from the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Joseph Napier, where it spotted the 19 immigrants stranded on the rocky cliffs. Unfortunately, due to heavy sea state, the Coast Guard had to hold off on attempting the rescue until things calmed down. Once the Coast Guard was able to get one of its small vessels in the area, they used a heaving line to toss to the land and then had the people jump in the water one by one and pulled them safely to the vessel while they were wearing life jackets. Fortunately, in this situation, all 19 people were rescued without injury, but the Coast Guard reminds people, don't do this. Smugglers only care about one thing. They do not care about the safety of their passengers. They only care about their money, which means anybody who's willing to step on a vessel like this is putting themselves in severe danger. The Coast Guard has really stepped up its efforts in the past year trying to stop these illegal migration attempts. Since October 1st of 2022 through the end of 2022, the U.S. Coast Guard said it carried out more than 14 illegal voyage interdictions just in the Moana Passage near the waters where this crew was found. Just in this one small area during that 3-month period, the Coast Guard detained 419 non-U.S. citizens, including 327 Dominicans and 91 Haitians. The Coast Guard urges people, if you have family, friends, or relatives who are talking about trying to do something like this, do everything in your power to try and talk them out of it. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us up to the Canadian coast, where this was the scene a little over a week and a half ago when a man and his 2 dogs were rescued after a sailboat ended up grounded along Canada's Vancouver Island. This crew was sailing about 45 miles west of Victoria, British Columbia, when the vessel lost power and wound up smashing into the rocks along the coastline. Fortunately, the crew was able to get a distress call out, and the Coast Guard launched one of its search and rescue helicopters to the scene, where it successfully pulled the man and one of his dogs from the wreckage. The Coast Guard returned the next morning to try and see if there was any pollution, and to their surprise, they actually found and rescued the second dog, and were able to bring the dog back to Victoria and reunite it with its owner. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. If you ever see anything crazy happening out on your waterways, be sure to hit me up on Facebook or Instagram and let me know, and you might see your stories over here, just like Knut Jacobson did this week. And if you guys haven't already, go ahead and drop an anchor on the subscribe button here.